Hi guys, so this week we're going to be looking at Australia's entry into World War One. On the next slide you're going to just be reviewing what's happened previously. Okay, so with the last major war being fought in 1871, Australia had a generation of men and women who had grown up with no real experience of war. Pretty much all they'd known about war was what they'd heard from their grandparents, and that was about the Boer War. And I can assure you the Boer War was easily won by the British Empire, and they got through it pretty quickly without many casualties. So apart from a small number of soldiers who had fought for Britain in Africa during the late 1800s, Australia had no experience of war and had little understanding of what it meant. Largely as a result of this inexperience, there was a perception that war was glorious, exciting and heroic. So they had this idealistic and naive view of war. So young people, especially boys, were brought up on military stories and were taught military drills in schools, and these were just the basic sort of things. In these stories, the heroes were rarely wounded or killed, they won their battles effortlessly, and the drills they taught them were to obey orders and to work together. This idealist outlook on war and military involvement encouraged a romantic view of military action. It was all about the glory. It was and the honour. It was never about, the hardships that actually occurred. So, when World War I began in 1914, Australia had been a single federated united country for only 13 years. And that's because we became a federation in 1901. And although Australia was a self-governing country, it was still a dominion of the British Empire. So we still were one of the British colonies. And we were obliged to follow the instructions of Britain in many areas of government. As a result, when Britain declared war on Germany, Australia automatically became involved, as did all other countries that were part of the British Empire. So we were required to actually become a part of World War I because of our loyalty to Britain.
From 1914 to 1918, the world was consumed by a war at a scale like no other, with more than 100 nations worldwide eventually becoming involved. Australia was one of these nations, and, being part of the Commonwealth, it had a duty to reinforce Great Britain's army. But war wasn't just going on elsewhere. In Australia, tensions were high too, and these tensions revolved around enlistment and conscription. This video will examine the different reactions to the war, opposition to conscription, and various other topics which will help deduce whether enlisting to serve in World War I was an easy choice for Australian men to make. On balance, the evidence suggests that enlisting was not an easy choice due to the two very contrasting arguments which would have been prominent throughout the war. However, as the war progressed, the decision to enlist would have become less appealing. When war first broke out, Australian men were eager to participate, with many trying to enlist before it was even possible. Over the next 2 years, however, the view towards war began to become less unanimous, and opposition to enlistment started gaining a powerful voice. At the start of the war, Australia had such an overflow of men recruiting that they had to turn people away. After the news of casualties started being reported, these numbers dropped, and by 1916 there was a shortage of volunteers to enlist. When the government began campaigning for conscription, the dynamics changed drastically. Many men were pressured to join by family and friends, and it was thought of as the honourable thing to do. One source shows the impact of family views on men's decisions to enlist. This source is an image created by the New South Wales Recruiting Committee and gives insight into how men valued the opinions of their family and friends. The obvious difference in colour between the two sections of the poster give insight into how the message was intended to be received. By making the upper picture brighter and more appealing and the lower image darker and bleak, the idea that serving is noble and more appealing is expressed. Requiring more soldiers, Prime Minister Billy Hughes pushed for conscription twice, once in 1916 and again in 1917. In this period, the government put large amounts of effort and funding into influencing the public to vote yes. A lot of the posters put up were centered on shaming those who voted no. One particular example is the Antis' Creed. Looking at some of the lines, it could be inferred by an individual reading the poster that those who opposed conscription were traitors and supporters of the enemy. This writing has a condescending tone, which seems like it is scorning the reader and evoking feelings of shame and guilt from those intending to vote against conscription. Whilst there was a large amount of peer pressure for men to enlist, there was also equal pressure not to. The main opposers of conscription were feminist groups such as the Women's Peace Army, labour union groups such as Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and even some returned soldiers. Many in these groups argued that war was inhumane or that Australia did not have an obligation to assist the Allies. Anti-conscriptionists also released their own media to combat the government's material. One such piece of media is the poster The Blood Vote, which has been referred to as the single most influential piece of campaign material produced by the anti-conscription campaign. This poster is an example of how women influence men's decisions to enlist. Similar to the Antis' Creed, The Blood Vote has an accusatory tone, but focuses on women and their identity as mothers. This poem likens mothers voting yes to directly killing their own children and uses the pen as a metaphor for a dagger. This piece of anti-conscription media gives a good idea of what the opposition to the war was like and how they structured their arguments. Both sides of the debate placed a strong emphasis on family and loyalty when trying to persuade members of the public, and this can be seen as reflective of the times. After analysing both sides of the argument, it can be determined that, most likely, enlisting was not an easy choice for men in World War I. This can be attributed to the large amount of debate and mixed information from both sides of the argument. There would have been family pressure, peer pressure, and government pressure. However, as the war progressed and the information of casualties came to light, it is obvious that whatever original excitement there had been around war was beginning to waver. Due to these highly polarizing views for and against the war, it can be inferred that enlisting was not an easy choice for men either way.
Okay, so from that video, you sort of got a little bit of both sides of the argument. But at the very start of the war, there was a lot of excitement and enthusiasm for joining the war. And this was a big sentiment. So if my country's worth living in, it's worth fighting for. So save our empire, keep the flag flying, right? They were all about saving, Australia as a country, but also saving Britain. So if we happen to look at this map here, we can see that the countries in red are actually countries that were in 1914 part of the British Empire. And because they were part of the British Empire, they were required to actually join the British when they were fighting in World War I. So, the coming of war, declared on the 4th of August 1914, caught most Australians by surprise, even though there'd been a climate for war for many years. There was an expectation that had arisen of a clash between Europe's two major trading nations, Britain and Germany. However, because we were so far removed from all of that. We weren't really aware that it had gotten that bad, right? The other countries that you learnt last week, right, they were preparing for war. They knew it was coming and they were preparing for it. Australia was not in that particular discussion in any way, right? We pretty much didn't see it as our war until Britain came along and declared war. So Australia was in the middle of an election campaign when war came. Both leaders, Joseph Cook, the Prime Minister at the time, and Andrew Fisher, leader of the Labor Party, promised Australian support to Britain. So no matter what happened, they were going to send troops to the war. Labor won the federal election and became an enthusiastic win the war party in government, supporting the initial pledge of 20,000 men. The new government watched an extraordinary rush to enlist all around the country and soon promised to increase the expeditionary force to take the total to 50,000 men. So that initial 20,000 men was pretty much taken up within the first couple of weeks. And people just wanted to join the war because they'd heard all these great stories about why war was so adventurous and all that sort of stuff, right? And so they increased that number to 50,000 men, which was a little bit harder to get because as the war actually started and we started not doing as well as what we had thought, news got back to families and it ended up turning into something that was more of a really hard decision, which you heard about in the video before. So, questioning our involvement. So not all Australians were enthusiastic about the war, as you saw in that video. Some argued that it was not Australia's war and that Australian troops would make little difference to the final outcome of the war. In some cases that was true, in others it wasn't. So others were opposed to the war because they were pacifists. So a pacifist is somebody who believes that, we shouldn't be at war, right? That all violence is bad. And there's a better definition at the end of this PowerPoint. So there was also a small group known as the conscientious objector who did not agree that Australia should go to war. And they did this on religious grounds or because their conscience would not allow them to, participate in something so violent. So some people also did not enlist because they were afraid, which is logical, or because they believed it was in their best interest financially to stay at home. They usually used poor health or family responsibilities to explain their decision not to enlist. So they would say, if I go, then my family will be destitute. And for some cases, it actually was the case.
We were told there's a property due south.
Yeah, old Dan's place. Got about 10 more miles to go. He'll probably give you a ride to Allenby. Where you headed?
Perth.
Oh, I nearly went there once. Thought I ought to see one big city before I die. You looking for work?
No, I'm off to the war.
What war?
The war against Germany.
I knew a German once. How did it start?
Don't start him.
Don't know exactly, but it was the Germans' fault.
The Australians fighting already.
In Turkey.
Turkey? Why's that?
Ask him.
Because Turkey's a German ally.
Well, you learn something every day. Still, can't see what it's got to do with us.
If we don't stop them there, they could end up here.
And welcome to it.
Alrighty, so you saw in that video then, that's from the movie Gallipoli. It was all about the whole idea of, we've got to help out our mother country, so Britain, but it was also because we were naive, we didn't know what was going on, and there were people who lived in the country who literally had no idea that there was even a war going on. So there were a couple of different reasons for enlisting, and you saw in the video that it was because, they were afraid that they may come here, but there was also they were driven by a desire to show what their new nation could do and contribute to a world conflict. Remember, we were only technically 13 years old as a country, so they wanted to really show what we could do. We had loyalty to mother country, so Britain. We wanted to show support for Britain in case Australia should need Britain's help at some stage in the future, which is still true today. There was a spirit of adventure. It'd be a great adventure to go overseas and, fight with your mates. And it was an opportunity to see the world, meet beautiful foreign women, and experience life beyond Australian shores, right? Remember, we are very isolated down here, right? So seeing the world, this was an opportunity that normally money couldn't afford. So it was also to impress the opposite sex, so women liked a man in uniform, and there was a lot of campaigns encouraging people to enlist about midway through the war that was pretty much encouraging men to join because you looked good, and the women would like that. The opportunity to earn a good income, so regular 6 shillings or 60 cents per day, and you may look at that and go, oh, I have that in my pocket right now, but back then it was a lot of money, and it was regular, and a lot of people who were unemployed didn't get that kind of money, and going to war would actually give that an income that would be paid. You can get away from their wives and commitments. Some people were forced into marriage in regards to family commitments, and they didn't particularly like who they were married to, so they would join the war, or they had commitments. Some people even joined the war because they had debts that they owed and they wanted to get away from the debtors, so war would do that. They wanted to escape the boredom of jobs that they hated, to leave school early, or to escape family restrictions. So you got out of a lot of things if you went to war. There was this unfortunate thing of going to war that got in the way of that. For some, it was the hatred of the enemy, which was perpetuated by propaganda, which was exaggerating German atrocities. So here are some of the propaganda posters that were in World War I. Right, the trumpet calls is a big one, and it's all about, come over here, and you've got to have a look at the colours of the words and what's actually happening. You've got the guy there in the bandage, and that's to represent the whole idea that just because you're hurt doesn't mean that you stop fighting. You keep fighting, because that's what an Australian does. And then, were you there then, right? The capitalisation of you is really important because it's, directly asking you to pay attention. And if you have a look at the flag, right, it's all torn up. And it's saying that, Australia is being, destroyed. You need to help them, right? And, of course, the inclusion of a woman is to encourage people to pay attention, especially if you're male. Right, so this is the same sort of thing, and this was trying to get people to recruit. At the early stages, they didn't need many posters, to create this rush for enlistment, but as the war continued and more information fed back to Australia, they were pretty much trying to convince you that you needed to go. And this was all based on the fact that they, could come here. So will you fight now or wait for this? And it's pretty much saying that the Germans would come here. And that drove a lot of people to enlist. Would you stand by while a bushfire raged, get busy and drive the Germans back? So it was all about the Australian, maintaining the Australian idea and the whole idea of, mateship and making sure that we're actually helping our mates. So this is a big one. Right, Australia has promised Britain 50,000 more men. Will you help us keep that promise? And this was one that's used quite a lot, and it's really important that you remember that propaganda posters such as this, right, were quite prevalent in getting people to join World War I.
Here you can see a propaganda poster from World War I. The first task you need to complete when analysing propaganda posters is to identify what you actually see. This flip video will teach you how to do this now. The first thing I can see is a kangaroo. The second thing I recognise is the number 50,000, right across the propaganda poster. The third thing that grabs my attention is the silhouette which highlights Australian soldiers eagerly going to battle, as we can see in the background here. On the poster, there is also persuasive language. The next phase of analysing a piece of propaganda is to identify the symbols you can see. We're back at the kangaroo. This is because the kangaroo draws on Australia's young history as a nation. The next symbol is the silhouette of the soldiers all going to war together. This symbolises that the men that will be joining will not be alone, and there is a sense of camaraderie. The third symbol is the colours of red and black. These colours capture the audience attention. The last phase of analysing a propaganda poster is to identify the language that has been used. As we can see, Australia has promised Britain 50,000 more men. Will you help us keep that promise? Australia is certain on keeping this promise. They are so certain on keeping this promise that they've used the repetition of promise twice in the same poster. Let's analyse another propaganda poster from World War I, just so that we can really understand how to do this. On this poster, I see an Australian soldier. In the background, I can see a map of Turkey, specifically the Dardanelles. From my prior knowledge, I also know the Dardanelles is a place where Australians fought. I can also see that there is persuasive language yet again. I'm now going to identify symbols. Symbol 1. Let's consider how the soldier is presented in this poster. The soldier is fit, he's strong, obviously well equipped, and he looks quite healthy. Symbol 2 is how large the soldier actually is. This emphasises the ability to stand over the enemy, as he is standing on the map of the Dardanelles in Turkey. We'll also look at the language used for this poster. Cooee is a colloquial term. This engages the audience of the time with a common term that they can recognise. This is similar to us saying something like oi. They're asking the audience a question, won't you come here? So they are directly speaking to the audience. And by saying won't you come, it is a call to action, along with enlist now.
So here is the definition for pacifists. So it's a noun, plural noun is pacifists. So a person who believes that war and violence are unjustifiable. A conscientious objector are people who opposed war and refused to perform military service because it went against their beliefs, religion or conscience. And this was something that was quite big, and you were made fun of if you were a conscientious objector. So the weekly task for this week is to identify motives and sources. So you'll need to open up the Term 3, Week 3 Identifying Motives and Sources document in the Compass class feed. Sometimes it'll be in Teams as well. In this task, you'll need to answer the motivations and attitudes of Australians who enlisted in World War I, and then analyse a propaganda poster that was used to encourage Australians to join World War I. When analysing a propaganda poster, you'll need to look at the following. So you can use the information from the video and also the information below. So the target audience, so who was the poster aimed at? The context, what was occurring at the time that this poster was created? So be specific. So what's happening at this particular time when this poster came out? Right? Don't just say the war. What exactly was happening during that time? So months, dates, where was the war being fought? Where were the Australians? So the message, what is the poster trying to convince people to do or stop doing? So what are they trying to get you to do? And then how does the poster try to influence the audience? So what words have they used? What images have they used? Where have they put capitalization? Think about the color as well. Right? Sometimes the color does mean something. And so you need to have a look at all of those. With the extension and enrichment task for this week, once again, these are optional. You don't have to do them, but it is strongly recommended. What you may want to do is watch and listen to the following video that has the first-hand accounts of 5 Australian veterans recalling their memories and recruitment of an enlistment into the AIF in 1914 to 1919. And you can click that link in the weekly plan and then summarise why the 5 men chose to enlist to fight into World War I, and then you'd upload it to the week 3, term 3. For the enrichment activity, you can watch the following videos to review how World War I started. So we're just reviewing what happened last week. Just be aware, they're actually quite interesting videos and they're very creative, but the first video, it does have some language that you probably won't deem as inappropriate, but us old fuddy-duddies would. So language may offend. Don't watch it if you may be offended by it. It's not the bad words, really bad ones, but you may want to avoid that one if you're a bit sensitive to that. Creative activity. So this one I've added this week. You may want to create a digital poster or video similar to the ones that encouraged Australians to enlist in World War I. So you're creating like a propaganda poster, and I know some of you guys have already done some of these, but instead of doing it for World War I want you to do it so it encourages Australians to wear a mask or socially distance due to COVID, right? So you're trying to put in, you're trying to encourage people to do it, and you follow those key guidelines that were mentioned in the video before. If you finish it, please submit. I'd love to be able to show them online, and there'll always be points and prizes for those who do a good job. Alrighty, have a good week. Oh, references too.